Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm again joined by Tim Patton to discuss the American Civil War. So, thanks for coming on again, Tim. So why don't you start the discussion for us?
All right. Well, I'm going to open up here with I think is the first point that must be made is I think in general, if you talk about the Civil War, whatever you think the causes is, I think the key point is first of all, slavery must be contextualized. If someone like Hobbes or Matt Ridley even today points out like life before 1900, and Keith Preston pointed this out before as well. You got like it's not like slavery looks in some ways to progressive eyes and modern eyes horrific, but like lots of labor systems at the time, mill workers, coal mine workers. I think that's the first point that must be made. I think you would agree generally with this point that slavery is less ridiculous looking in the 1860s and the 1800s when you're comparing it to like coal mine workers or plantation, lots of manual labor jobs. It's just a different form of social organization. So I think that's the first point that must be made when discussing slavery. And slavery was very common throughout human history. You get it all sorts of different forms and stuff like that. Thomas Sowell will make this point. I think Walter Block will make this point. So lots of people will make this point. Keith Preston made that point in one of your more recent podcasts as well. So you would agree with this?
Oh, yeah. It was basically universal and compared to the working conditions. And I mean, after all, didn't they in England call the factories satanic mills?
Yes.
In fact, one of the common arguments made by slaves is that they treated their slaves better than Yankee workers. In fact, I think that was mentioned in your econ talk lecture that you sent me by Munger.
Yes.
Where he talks about that. And it's interesting, even people on the left, like say Noam Chomsky, will concede that. They'll just say that if you're a rich slave, if you're a slave that's taken care of, it doesn't really matter. You're still a slave. But it's interesting. I think I've heard, if I'm not mistaken, Noam Chomsky's even said that before too.
Yes. Noam Chomsky said that. He made the argument that he didn't make the argument, but this was his response to his debate with Michel Foucault on moral relativism, and he was just trying to supplant moral realism, defend moral realism, and saying that freedom is the better good. But it's sort of weird because he argues that wage slavery is a form of slavery, so which goes right back in the Civil War because I'm not saying it's a point for or against the Union, but when you're comparing economic systems and modes of production, it's not like most workers in the North were somehow,
better off.
I think slavery in the end is a tyrannical institution, but at the time it's less tyrannical, but it's tyrannical for different reasons, I think, than what a lot of modern mainstream says it is. And I think we'll get into this. Would you agree?
Yeah. I think in some extent slavery is sort of like, it's a word that doesn't mean much anymore, sort of like Nazi, fascist, and whatever, because it's almost like a political swear word at this point. And the variations throughout history of the nuances of slavery are not really appreciated.
Yes. I mean, you had a similar system. Now, Richard Pipes doesn't totally agree with the comparison. He had similar. People couldn't leave 25 miles in Russia. In your books that you recommended to me, So when we talk about the Confederacy, for example, and we say nice things about the Confederacy, or when Lord Acton, as Lorenzo points out, it's not the economic systems at the time are much more different than today. I think that's due to industrialization. But that's a side debate. But I think we should start in with the. I think we should start with the debate between De Lorenzo and Jaffa, because I think that's the most interesting one of the list. Again, I mean, I think the Hummel piece that I gave to you was pretty good as well, but on the Rubin podcast. But the Hummel piece goes into the causes of the war, and I think this is a very long-running debate. And I was interested in what your thoughts on it is. I mean, I'll go for a short monologue about summarizing De Lorenzo versus the Jaffa debate. And the question of the Civil War is primarily about, there's two camps. There's people who think it's about tariffs and states' rights and the Constitution, and the other side is it's all about slavery. So those are the two main camps that go into it. And in that debate, De Lorenzo defends this is sort of the Tom Woods, Ron Paul, Tom Lorenzo. If there's the libertarian, the Misesian libertarian Rothbard Bible for the Civil War, it's probably Tom Lorenzo's book on the real Lincoln, and that's what is being summarized in that. It's a great debate. So a lot of these, and so in this debate, Lincoln, Lorenzo takes you might call it a hatchet job on Lincoln, but he calls Lincoln a mercantilist and a follower of the Whig economic program. Hummel does the same thing. This is not a very radical claim, but I think what De Lorenzo does, he takes the Whig economic program and he takes it further. So one of the things was the tariff of abomination. So what De Lorenzo points out is they were threatening to raise the tariffs from something like 15% to 45%. And as Lorenzo points out, that 85% of the tariff duties, the total duties, were being paid by southern states. The northerners were largely produced all they could internally, and they were getting finished goods shipped in from places like Europe and so forth. And that's where they were getting these huge tariffs. These tariffs were going to affect them, which is also interesting because a lot of these Whig economic internal improvement programs were being paid for indirectly by slavery in some sort of obscure sense. So that's De Lorenzo's argument. And as De Lorenzo points out, the Lincoln-Douglas debate was not a national debate. It was an Illinois Senate debate, the famous ones. That was back when the senators were being elected on the state level. So what would you say about De Lorenzo's point about tariffs or slavery, and Joffe's point about tariffs as slavery being the primary cause?
Well, right. It's interesting because I think it was 1833 when there was the first tariff crisis and Andrew Jackson threatened to invade South Carolina if they nullified his tariff laws. And so they abandoned that nullification because they didn't have enough states to join them in their secession. When you look at the Civil War, part of the problem is with these camps is in history, there's no such thing as monocausality. There's no one factor that leads to a historical event. Some causes might be more important. They might have more explanatory power. They might have more of an impact, but it's never just one factor. So, I think ultimately with or without slavery, there probably would have been a civil war because a few years back, I read all the Federalist Papers and maybe half of the Anti-Federalist Papers. And one of the Anti-Federalists said the way the Constitution was set up with the Supreme Court and the central government having sort of like being the highest court in the land, they could overturn state court rulings. And it was set up to centralize power in the federal government to a degree. And so ultimately, there would be a showdown between the states and between the federal government. How that showdown was cashed out, it could have easily been free states leading in antebellum America. Like in the War of 1812, New England threatened to secede because they thought a war with England was a mistake. And there were abolitionists in the North, like William Lloyd Garrison, who wanted to secede from the South. So again, it could have been a number of factors, and it could have been the North seceding. So 1812 wasn't about slavery at all, but New England threatened to secede. So it happened to be that of all the factors, it's probable that slavery was one of the factors that was a fault line that led to this states versus the federal government showdown. But it could have easily been something else. The showdown could have occurred sooner on another issue entirely. And also, as you point out, it's hard to ignore the tariffs because South Carolina did threaten to secede in 1833 over tariffs. So that's another factor as well. But I think there's multiple layered factors. For example, I don't know if you saw my interview a year or two ago with that League of the South guy. And he pointed out that the South is just a different people. They come from, the borderlands of Scotland and Northern Ireland, the Scotch, Welsh, Irish attitude. And slavery or no, they're just fundamentally different people than East Anglians and the Midlanders who settled in other parts of America. So there's that factor as well. So I think there's a multitude of factors, and how you weigh the importance of one or the other depends on your perspective. So Jaffa is going to prioritize slavery. The libertarians are going to prioritize the states' rights element, and the Southerners are probably going to want to emphasize we're just a different people element. And then there's a combination of all of that.
Do you agree with the line? This is the Lorenzo point, because I think is Ron Paul's point. This is Tom Wood's point, that the Civil War was the culmination of the sort of the Hamiltonians versus the sort of Jeffersonian conception of the Constitution, where the Jeffersonians had this sort of more limited version of it, where it was only, I think it's the word, enumerated powers. It was nothing bigger. And then Hamilton had see, it's funny. People like Michael Malice. This is why I like Michael Malice's debate with Tom Woods over Hamilton, because Hamilton had the big wig. He was, and Lorenzo points out with another one of his historians brings, is that Lincoln was the son of Hamilton and Henry Clay. This sort of internal improvements, urbanization, central banks, protective tariffs, and that having that sort of stuff is only a Hamiltonian strong central state with a strong treasury, and so to speak. Do you agree with that?
I think that there's a case that can be made for that, and I think to sort of skip ahead to another interview is the Hummel interview. I think the most important and interesting point that Hummel made was the deleterious effects of the size of the growth of government due to Abraham Lincoln. Because the massive acceleration of the growth of government was the result of Lincoln, because from Thomas Jefferson to James Buchanan, the federal government was actually shrinking in size. And then after Lincoln, it started to grow exponentially, because there's a whole different attitude of the people in charge, in part. And I think that was because not only, does all the foreign wars that we got involved in, but also the domestic issues at home due to the large, powerful, and interventionist government. And I think that does certainly seem to be that, because weren't the Whigs the descendants of didn't Jaffe even say that Washington was the first of the Whigs and the Hamiltonians?
Yes, Jaffe, by the way, is not progressive by no means. I mean, he's advocate. He's written for the National Review. He's written for. He calls himself a conservative of some variety. And I know some people in some of your audience might not like National Review, so to speak, but Jaffa is someone I think who should not be dismissed open-handedly, even though he makes in the comments in the later part, he makes some sort of nasty remarks to Lorenzo and his supporters. But I think Jaffa deserves some respect on making the case.
He's certainly very erudite, and you see in his statements throughout the debate.
Yeah, so I think Jaffa's best case for slavery being the primary. Actually, so one of the things I'm somewhat agnostic about the Civil War, because what to think. So one of the interesting about last podcast, I'm not agnostic about the American Revolution. I think the American Revolution was a clear win, but I'm not sure if. I know some people don't like doing this, but I like polemicists and I like picking sides sometimes. I'm not really sure. It's not a slam dunk. And as Lorenzo points out, lots of the classical liberals throughout the world sided with, believe it or not, too many modernize the South. And they did it for reasons that I think partly because that the North had wage slavery, what they would call wage slavery, which wasn't that much different, and partly because the state was going to get much larger. I mean, even William Lord Garrison later in his life says the opposite, makes the opposite case at that time. Would you agree?
Yeah, it is. The Civil War, again, is agnostic, because you could say on the one hand, yes, the North wins and frees the slaves, but then you get this out of control federal government. And, it's also assuming that slavery would not have been abolished some other way. A lot of the Church of Lincoln types, it's what the libertarians like to call them, they assume that was the only way you could have ended slavery. But they don't know that. And since less violent methods didn't really seem to be pursued by the North, we don't really know if some sort of negotiated settlement or, paying the slave holders to release their slaves would have really worked. It just really wasn't tried, from what I could tell from all the content you gave me to look at.
Yeah, Jaffa's argument against this idea is that they tried. They tried in the border states, and that most of the Southerners refused. They tried earlier, and his argument was that the value of the slaves. So I guess Jaffa is something of an economic liberal, classical economic liberal, and his argument was that slavery was profitable. It wasn't unprofitable. So many of the libertarians who side with the Confederacy in the end side with it because they think slavery in the long run is unprofitable. But Jaffa's point is that slavery was profitable, and that it was, if it could have gotten grown west into the territories, it would have grown further. That's, I think, Jaffa's best argument, and that they wouldn't have accepted a settlement because it was more profitable keeping slavery than getting the compensation. Now, as Lorenzo points out, lots of other slave owners in West Indies, French colonies, Argentina. He has a list of when all these emancipation dates point out. And one final point, it's worth pointing out that after about 10 years, I think, as Hummel points out, the Northerners lost their will to have, if the Northerners, really wanted emancipation and full rights, it's not, and it's going to point out, people like Lincoln were not, now you could argue that they evolved positions, but they were not arguing for full enfranchisement. And Lincoln has some real one-liners that would make many sort of modern left liberals cry. In his mainstream speeches, he makes these comments.
Yeah, I think in his speech with Stephen Douglas, didn't he say that just because I don't want to be a slave or a master doesn't mean I want to live with the Negro?
Yeah. So,
so yeah, that's one of those statements that wouldn't go down too well today. I think in the larger counter narrative that libertarians have been pushing about Lincoln, I really think the idea that, okay, Lincoln was a racist is a really super weak argument, because our concept of race relations, nobody in the 1860s would have even come close. So that just seems to be ad hoc projecting onto the past and is the weakest of their arguments.
Yeah. And even people like William Lord Garrison, in some ways, who was probably the strongest, purest abolitionist, I think this is one reason I like Thaddeus Russell. As Thaddeus Russell points out, is in some ways, by modern views of race relations, is a racist as well, which is as a paternalistic racist, which is funny. The Civil War is very, very interesting conversation in that regard. But back to Jaffa, do you think the tariff issue, though, and this is Jaffa's argument, is tied up with having slaves because they weren't industrializing? Most of the railroads were in the north. If you look at railroad mileage, most of the factories were in the north. And actually the north was growing more food at that time than the south, even though the south had more acreage, and that the tariffs only the tariffs only affected them precisely because they had slavery, which is part of the reason why the Northerners pushed them. What do you think about that argument that Jaffa's making?
Well, I would say that I don't know really what to say about the argument, because there are for example, there are other slave societies at the time, like Brazil, I think Spain still at the time, or at least, maybe not Spain, I know Brazil was. And so, did Brazil have high tariffs or free trade? If the correlation is the tariffs related to the slavery issue, it might be. But it would be helpful if he had compared, or Di Lorenzo had compared the South to other 19th century slave societies and looked at their trade policies. Because I don't know, I would imagine Brazil would be protectionist. Because if it's...
almost everyone was protectionist at the time, I think. That's one of the benefits.
So then if Brazil is protectionist and they're a slave society, then there's no necessary conflict between protectionism and slave societies. I think Jaffa needs a little, at least from that debate, I don't think he proved enough to prove that point. Maybe in his written material he did, but
yes. I haven't. Jaffa's. I only found him through Di Lorenzo, and I was looking for arguments against Lorenzo, because Lorenzo's book is a book that Ron Paul points to as like the primary source on it. So I'll move on to Lincoln himself. What's your opinion of Lincoln? Do you think he's the epitome of Alexander Hamiltonianism and sort of the Whig policy? That's what Hummel says. That's what De Lorenzo says. That's what the mainstream historians say as well. This is not a very radical claim. And I'll ask the classic question like that to you is, do you think Lincoln is at all, I think Rothbard calls him a humanitarian with a guillotine. Do you think Lincoln is in some way a Jacobin at all in your parlance? What would you say to that claim?
Yeah, well, as far as Lincoln, I mean, he's without, whether you like him or not, he's one of the most successful mercurial presidential candidates in history. I mean, he basically self-taught, grew up in the backwoods, and becomes president. I mean,
yeah,
that right, you know, even his detractors admit that. But then the other question is, I think the idea that Lincoln was a mercantilist is probably true. Then again, though, I think it's a pretty weak argument against him too, because if we look at the United States and the transcontinental railroads, the libertarians can only point to one railroad that was built without government funding, and that was
the Great Northern.
Yeah. So the point is, they seem to act like, okay, if we didn't have state funding, we would have had transcontinental railroads. Really? Because you can only point to one. So I'm not entirely sure that the transcontinental railroads would have been built at all because of the amount of capital necessary. The other problem with private railroads is they serve the private interest, not the national interest, because people want railroads not just to buy and sell goods, but to move troops.
Yes.
And so a private railroad like the Great Northern is not going to have that as a consideration. So, and in the 1860s, the United States was still vulnerable to invasion. I mean, England could have invaded before or after that date, and
the French appointed a, what was it? They appointed a king to Mexico. They brought
Maximilian.
Yeah. So, which after the U.S. Civil War, they went in and got rid of him, if I recall, or dismissed him, or something, or threatened to.
The Union threatened to invade Mexico. And they left. So in that sense, the railroad is serving more than just a purely commercial purpose. And again, that's assuming that you would have had not only built railroads without state funding, but have more efficient railroads. And again, I don't see the evidence for that because they can only point to one. And the Great Northern was a good railroad, but there are other good railroads too. And it was kind of a niche railroad because it was up to Canada. It didn't really cross the country, uniting California and the gold miners and the immigrants from Asia to the rest of the country. It was more of a niche railroad in that regard. The best argument against Lincoln is the oldest one, that he was a tyrant, that he revoked habeas corpus, threw people in prison, and engaged in tactics that were extremely brutal for the time. If you look at European wars like the wars of German unification, the Franco-Austrian War, the Crimean War, civilians were largely ignored. They were not brought into the conflict.
One quick side note. This is one of the things. This is why De Lorenzo is great. De Lorenzo brings up the history that Lincoln would they in like states like New York in the 1864 election. There was one editorial that said that Lincoln won the election with the force of bayonets. I mean, newspapers that weren't advocates of him or the Union war effort were not allowed to be shipped on federal mail, and if they used couriers, they would arrest the couriers. So lots of people were imprisoned. And these were Northerners that were imprisoned. These aren't Southerners that were imprisoned. These were, Northern opinion editorials and so forth. So, so I think the best argument against Lincoln is he's a tyrant. So do you think? So, but back to what you were saying.
Yeah, I think that's the best argument against him. And I would overall say Lincoln is probably more bad than good because the out-of-control federal government has had a lot of deleterious consequences down the road. And in many ways, Lincoln was instrumental in changing the attitudes of American political leaders towards that kind of path and that kind of a road. And the other thing is, the secessionist movement, should they have just let the South secede? A lot of people say, well, on the pro-Lincoln side, well, what was Lincoln supposed to do? He just couldn't let them leave. And I'm like, well, you could have. I mean, Norway. See, after the Napoleonic War, Sweden and Norway became a joint kingdom, and then, like, I think 1912, Norway just seceded and left. Sweden didn't invade Norway and do all sorts of terrible things like that. They just let Norway leave, and there wasn't any wars and conflicts in Scandinavia due to the sundering of Norway and Sweden. So yeah, there is some precedent that you can have a people of very close ethnic identity. So Swedes and Norwegians, and then of course North America, Yankees and Dixians. They're so close that, you know, you could have easily imagined, as Hummel speculates, 3 republics: Canada, the United States, and
also Texas too. I mean, Texas existed for like 9 years as a independent sovereign state. So it's not unprecedented to have multiple republics on the continent.
But I think on the other hand, though, one of the things that the Church of Lincoln does get is that in order to, if his goal was to preserve the Union, to sort of put this all together and win the war. Now we can talk about, you know, there's some people that criticize this mismanagement of the war, and I think that's something to get into later. But it is, in a, you know, as Lord Acton said, most of the great men of history are in fact bad men. Yeah. So Lincoln was a great man in the sense of the great man of history, but he was probably a bad man in the sense of how he got it done. I mean, Caesar was a great man, but he was a horrible person that did all sorts of terrible things in Gaul and things like that. So I think in that sense, Lincoln was a great man of history, but a bad man in the sense of Lord Acton.
In this sense, I agree with most libertarian takedowns of Lincoln, in the sense that Lincoln gets this, like, the sort of public school grade version of Lincoln it's just nonsense. I mean, it's just a canard of nonsense. I mean, and because first of all, his position on slavery evolved. So if it was about slavery, when he started the war, he said he didn't give a darn about slavery. He would keep it if he could keep the Union together. So, you know, and I think the best argument for the pro-Lincoln people is which actually makes Lincoln look really bad, if this is the case, is why would the South lose 1 in 3 men between the ages of 15 and 35 over a tariff dispute? But I think you could flip that around and ask, why would the North lose 1 in 7 men, because the North had huge casualty rates, because the South didn't want to pay tariffs? I think that's probably the best accusation against Lincoln. Would you agree?
Yeah, because especially if you look at it from an economic point of view, the predicted net income from the tariffs was probably far less than the actual physical cost of human capital and the cost in actual capital. So again, that does seem to make Lincoln out to be a tyrant. And I think the best case scenario is the one that the libertarians typically advocate, is let the 8 southern states leave. Because remember, if Lincoln didn't invade, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas would remain in the Union,
as well as Delaware and Maryland, I think.
Well, they remain nonetheless, because Lincoln took over those regions. But the point is that could have happened then, you know, as the abolitionists, anarchists in the North, like Garrison and Spooner pointed out, is that, you know, the slaves could have just come north. They were no longer obligated by the Fugitive Slave Act to protect them, and it would have dramatically raised the cost of keeping slaves in the South, because of course in the United States they could just defray the cost of maintaining slavery to the federal government and the states in the North with the Fugitive Slave Act. So the slavery, was it a Jaffa who said slavery was more secure in the Union than out of it?
Yes. Yes.
So, exactly. So let them go. And then furthermore, if you slap a tariff on any goods produced by slaves, you could even further cripple the economy.
Yeah. I mean, I think the best, I think the best scenario is like West Germany, East Germany, North Korea, South Korea. I procrastinating conflicts is very underrated in my view. You know, fight the war. Next generation, if we'll see what we, we'll see if we still want to go at it again. I think one argument that the anti-Lincoln people, the pro-Lincoln people, part of the Church of Lincoln people, don't take fully, and I get this from Neil Ferguson and Nassim Taleb, two of my favorite artists, is that a lot of people, you don't like monocausality, but if there are such things as causes, you don't necessarily need a large cause to cause a large event. So like take World War One. Why did some random assassination, not random, he was a key figure, but why did an assassination turn into a huge bloodbath? It's not clear.
Like for example, throughout the 19th century, heads of state were assassinated all the
And
time.
there was no major wars throughout then. So why did that go from there to there? So I think the best argument against the Church of Lincoln is that look at all the other cases where they advocated tariffs, and you didn't go kill what the numbers are quite barbaric. I mean, the only two conflicts I think are Western Front of World War One and Eastern Front of World War II in terms of population losses, damage to property. So it's
also the Napoleonic Wars.
In the Napoleonic Wars, but that was more of a pre-industrial conflict, I would argue. But and I mean, and some of the conflicts, and I think we should transition somewhat into the. Actually, I have a few more points about Lincoln I'd like to get to. One problem I don't like about the anti-Lincoln people, the Southern Nationalists and the libertarians, is they underrate the significance of the Fugitive Slave Act. Fugitive Slave Act. Now they will argue that the Constitution included the Fugitive Slave Act, the defense of the Fugitive Slave Act. But the Fugitive Slave Act, as Hummel points out, is one of the more tyrannical laws, tyrannical things the Congress ever passed. So here I printed out what he said. People had no gestation of jury right, no right to testify to the legislator, and the commissioners were to require the cooperation of individuals to apprehend runaways. And if you violated it, that you could face a jail sentence of $1,000 fine, $1,000 civil penalties for each escaped slave. This is in 1860. So, I mean, this is in northern states. And Jaffa points out that there was a case in 1854 where there was a slave that was in Massachusetts, where the federal government under, I think it's Pierce, Buchanan, nationalized brought in troops. They brought the slave back to their owner. So, and they had these courts set up where if they had these sort of draconian bureaucracy set up to find runaway slaves. So $5 of so if you found a runaway slave, I mean, and the person himself had no right to say it wasn't. Found a black that you thought was your slave, you went to this committee. They could expropriate him. So I think the Southern Nationalists and the libertarians underrate the fugitive slave, not slavery itself, but the Fugitive Slave Act, which is, now you could claim that it's constitutional. You could claim that the southern states only passed it because it was constitutional. What would you say about that?
I think you're right. They do tend to overlook the importance of that, because basically it's saying the rest of the country has to pay for apprehending their slaves. I think it was Thomas Jefferson who said that it's immoral to force someone to pay for something that contradicts their conscience. And well, many in the North, that would contradict their conscience, but they're paying taxes in northern states, which are then required to apprehend these slaves. And also, I think it was Jaffa that pointed this out, and some others, that you get paid double for capturing a slave than proving that he was not a slave. So the incentive was then to find people who were slaves, which is interesting. But back to your earlier point, was Lincoln a Jacobin? I think overall the judgment of people like Thornwell and Dabney are correct, and Lincoln was a Jacobin, but more of a weak sense Jacobin. I mean, it wasn't like Lincoln went around like in the Vendée massacring a bunch of peasants, but he did wage a ruthless war with little regard for civilians. It wasn't so much that they directly shot them like you would see with communists or in the French Revolution, but he waged a war on their property, which of course could lead to their death, like when the siege of Vicksburg and Atlanta. And so there's that element too that comes into play. So I think he's, at least it's in the spirit of Jacobinism. I don't think he's a full-fledged one yet.
One argument I think that the sort of dividing conversation between the Church of Lincoln people and the anti-Church of Lincoln people. One argument I think the anti-Church of Lincoln people don't get and the Church of Lincoln people do get is that in order for Lincoln to do what needed to be done, I think he had to be quite brutal. Because first of all, the war itself wasn't as popular. I mean, there's lots of, and this is Hummel's. Hummel's a good historian. He goes through them. There's like 5 different planks of Northern Republican Whig opinion, and they range from radical abolition and full enfranchisement to something like no expansion to the territories. So the war itself, or just purely on tariffs. So this is Dorenzo's point. Plenty of Northerners only wanted the tariffs. They didn't really care about the slavery issue. They only wanted the tariffs. So the war itself wasn't as popular, and especially once these death counts started to come in after places like Shiloh, Manassas, and others, the war became more unpopular, and he had to be very Stalinist to maintain the government and to win the re-election. I mean, and some historians I think point to like the 1864 march through Savannah and South Carolina as part of his election campaign. So I think the anti-Churchill Lincoln people think that the Civil War could have been won more humanely. I don't. A lot of the casualties were due to disease. I think the advances in weapons were not. You could point to the Crimean War as being bloody and unexpected, but it's hard to say. I think it's not totally unreasonable to think that this war could have been less bloody, but
well, does that mean, do you want to shift into the war itself now? Because there's a lot of points to go from there. As far as could the war have been less bloody with the modern weapons? I mean, during the wars of German unification, they had similar modern weapons, and it didn't lead to these indecisive bloodbaths. I think one thing that has to be kept in mind is that the North and the South were essentially amateur forces, and it showed. And that's why the Europeans largely ignored any lessons from the Civil War, because they saw these as amateurs. And in Europe, they had professional soldiers. And so, like, Prussia beats Austria in a few weeks, beats France in a few weeks. And they all have, rifles and the even more advanced weapons like breech-loading cannons in the Franco-Prussian War. And yet, again, it didn't lead to these indecisive bloodbaths. I think so. Part of that would be due to the sort of non-professional amateur nature of the U.S. forces,
which is largely a benefit. I think in our last podcast, I asked you about Napoleon forming, which is largely a benefit not having huge standing armies standing around. Would you agree?
Yeah, it is. It is. But then again, there's also detractions, right? Because if there's a civil war like that, see, here's the thing, right? The Union Army was a blunt instrument, and they basically cudgeled the South to death. I mean, yeah, that's like the least sophisticated way to win a war. Just, it's almost like, communist human wave style. Grant is, universally known as the Butcher, because of his wilderness campaign and the siege of Petersburg and Richmond. And so we see, Grant the Butcher and the body counts that were driven up that way. It's in part because as amateurs, they can't perform a lot of sophisticated maneuvers. So the blunt instrument cudgeling is what they resorted to. And that's really the least efficient way to fight the conflict. Now, when it comes to efficiency, in one of the videos, podcasts you sent me, this was also Mesquita. He talks about how there was an economic model that predicted how long the war should last. Frankly, I find that to be absurd. You can't predict, as Clausewitz says on The Art of War, there's all sorts of factors you can control for, but there's certain factors you can't. And those factors you can't control for means the war could last a few weeks, as in the case of wars of German unification. Because if you look at Germany and France, they're both extremely industrial, advanced powers. You wouldn't necessarily predict it would be, 3 or 4 weeks. And the United States, the Civil War, these are relatively amateur, unprofessional soldiers. You wouldn't necessarily expect that to last 4 years. So, those factors just aren't tangible, not in any sort of meaningful way. But like I said, I do think that the war could have been managed in a more sophisticated. Well, both sides had faulty strategies. First thing is, Jefferson Davis basically wanted to fight the Union at the frontier. So don't give up any land to the South, sacred soil. And Lincoln, of course, wanted to starve the South out with the Anaconda Plan, and then, move down the Mississippi and start constricting it that way. Those are the two broad strategies that they wanted to pursue. But in my mind, the South could not have won the war without foreign intervention. The Civil War historian Shelby Foote said, there's no way the South could win. The Union outnumbered them 2-1 in population. Industrial production was far greater. They had to get foreign support, and the only way they could have conceived,
or the only way the South could have won was they could split the public opinion in North and get a settlement. That was the other option, and that's something that the Church of Lincoln people get. That for Lincoln, so Lincoln had a real to win the election in 1860. He had to really skin the cat, so to speak, because he couldn't irritate. He was pendant on both sides in the North because people didn't want the war and wanted some sort of settlement. And actually, in this way, the movie Lincoln is very accurate about this. I think, again, some people hate that movie. I don't know if you've seen it, but in that way, I think that's the best. That's the best Church of Lincoln movie made. But anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about Grant. I think Grant gets underrated because Grant was given, to me, an impossible task to subdue the South. I think that was on its surface because the South is humongous. New Orleans to Florida. What was Florida? Yeah, New Orleans to Georgia to Richmond to Tennessee. That's a huge space. It's not as populated, and the Union Army was very inexperienced. Like the war with Mexico was a limited war for relatively limited means. It did not have. It was really a war amongst elites, directed at the elites, which starts out with the Battle Cry of Freedom book, The Halls of Montezuma, where he goes through the history of the military campaign in Mexico. That was very much in the American military history because the American military won its revolution in. They basically made a lot of noise and eventually got France involved. As you just pointed out, the only way they could win is they could get France involved. That's what gave them really in the end gave them the victory. So I might have just talked myself out of my argument of splitting Northern opinion, but I think that's a possible reason. But I'd largely agree with you that the only way they could win is either split Northern opinion or get a foreign power involved. Would you agree?
I agree. Those are the two main ways to do it. And ultimately, if you look at Southern strategy, they really didn't do either very well. But one of the things is when we look at the sort of like Hall of Fame of Civil War generals on the South, we obviously have Lee and Jackson, the top, the best of the best, maybe below them, Longstreet and Early. And then in the North, we've got Grant and Sherman as touted as the best of the best. And I think in a lot of ways, these reputations except maybe Jackson. I think Jackson deserves it because he was brilliant. Needs to be revised. So, for example, Grant is called a butcher, and he was. Because in the Battle of the Wilderness, he lost 10,000 men and
all throughout 1864 in the Overland Campaign, he'd lose more soldiers than the Confederates, and they had 8. I think to get to cross the James River, which in one book Robert E. Lee calls the Christ, that was the end. To get to cross the James River. I'm making you take your finger, you start from Washington D.C., you go around the thumb. The Confederates get them at Spotsylvania. He goes around again, Wilderness. Goes around again, next finger, and eventually he gets himself in the middle of the peninsula outside of Richmond. So it's an incredibly barbaric task he's given, and he's given orders by Lincoln to pursue. Where Lee goes, you go, I think is what his order is. And I think he, as far as following through a task, I think a lot of people would not have the stomach to do what Grant did.
No, they would not. But the point that I bring up Grant is that for obvious reasons, Robert E. Lee's reputation is much higher. His civility, his gentlemanness. He's sort of like, along with Jefferson Davis, one of the Southern sage leaders that the Southerners with their lost cause narrative like to appeal to. But I think Lee needs to be revisited because Lee was a butcher too. In the 7 Days Battle in the summer of 1862, he lost a quarter of his army in a week. That's what you call a Pyrrhic victory. And what's even more absurd about it is after Jackson had finished the Shenandoah campaign, he said, give me 40,000 men and I could march into Pennsylvania. And Lincoln would call McClellan to protect Washington. And we'd lift the siege of Richmond without you having to lift a finger. And Davis and Lee ignored that. And then Lee pursued to destroy a quarter of his army. And I think that in some sense, and then of course, it's really miraculous to me how Lee's reputation survived Pickett's charge, one of the most ill-advised and stupid actions of any war. Not only did he charge a Union line, he charged the center, so he could get shot from the whole line. So that whole corps was just wiped out before he even got to the Union lines. I mean, that's every bit as absurd as the Union frontal attacks at Cold Harbor and Spotsylvania. And so in that sense, I think Lee needs to be knocked down a few pegs. Now, of course, Chancellorsville, had Jackson not got himself killed, probably would have bagged the Army of the Potomac. So he does have moments of brilliance, but I think he's somewhat overrated.
One thing I think what's the American West is worth, the American West theater is often forgotten. That's where Sherman and Grant, and actually Philip Sheridan as well, got their reputations. Grant gets his famous at, I think it's Fort Donelson. That's where he gets, he doesn't say it precisely, but that's where he gets the unconditional surrender name from. Where Grant does a series of campaigns against positions along the Mississippi and wins a fairly large swath of territory. Places like Corinth. Well, Corinth was when he got demoted, but the American West is Grant's, I want to call it baby, so to speak, and Sherman for that matter. And again, in the Western theater, the Confederates were terrible because they lost to Grant, a young Grant and a young Sherman. A lot of places, which, what would you think? Are you just not familiar with the Western theater of the American Civil War?
I would actually agree. In the Western theater, it tends to be ignored, I think, in part because Lee is such a charismatic individual. And of course, the Eastern theater is where the capital of
the more famous.
Yeah, the more famous battles. But it's true. The Union Army was almost ever victorious in the Western theater. And of course, Grant made a few mistakes, like in the 1862 when he first tried to besiege Vicksburg. He didn't guard his supply depots. And I think it was Nathaniel Bedford Forrest sacked him, and he had to winter up in the further north to then try again in 1863. But ultimately, yeah, he defeated every Confederate opponent sent against him, and he moved very quickly. I think Grant said the key to winning a war is get there the fastest with the mostest, or something like that, which is true, and that does tend to be ignored. But I think when you look at the Union generals, the one Union general that always gets overlooked, and I think he's the best in the North, is George Thomas, famous for his battle at Nashville. See, Nashville was the only battle in the Civil War where an army was completely annihilated in detail. The army of, I think it was John Bell Hood, was completely obliterated, and his forces were not reconstituted until early 1864. And that's just huge. It's the Battle of, was it Chickamauga? It was the Rock of Chickamauga. It's saving the army of Rosecrans from Longstreet. And whenever when he was and also the Battle of Chattanooga, his troops took Missionary Ridge, which was one of the decisive moments of that engagement. So as a junior commander operating under Grant and Rosecrans, he performed admirably. And as an independent commander, he defeated a Southern army in detail. He was accused of being overly cautious, but given the results that he produced, that's something you really can't complain too much about. And furthermore, he's the only Union general that I know of that defeated Stonewall Jackson. They were both operating as junior commanders in West Virginia in early 1861, and he actually was squared off against Jackson and defeated him. So he's like one of the unsung great leaders of the Civil War. And in part, his reputation has been ignored because of Grant and Sherman played down his role to inflate their own.
Yeah. So that's largely took a quick cursory through the war itself. But Let's move somewhat to the settlement of the war. One, the best case against the Church of Lincoln, I think, in the end, is that if the Church of Lincoln is so, in some ways, so progressive, then why is it that Lincoln and many of the Northerners were so unprogressive, and the settlement of the war was, if anything, I think this is, I'm going on, might go off the reservation here, but I think this is Howard Zinn's point. If anything, which are the School Sucks podcast, a lot of baggage comes out after the Civil War that might, in the long run, make it a lot worse off. So they got the victory at a high cost, okay, but now they have to do the occupation, and the occupation is in some ways a lot. If defeating these generals is hard, I think the occupation is going to be a lot harder, and it didn't go very well. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I think wasn't Andrew Johnson sort of impeached in part because the radical Republicans wanted to have a more extreme Reconstruction?
Yeah, they wanted to put a they wanted I forget what they wanted. I'm blanking on what their demands were, but yeah, they wanted Johnson was too lenient. He was from Tennessee, so.
I would say that the worst legacy of Reconstruction is the fact that the victorious Union armies, especially under the radical Reconstruction, used the recently freed blacks as political tools in order to subjugate the South, poisoning race relations for the next 150 years. This is stated by neo-Confederates. This is stated by libertarians. I think, in fact, in the real Lincoln, De Lorenzo points this out. Using them as a cheap political tool to sort of lorded over the defeated South only guaranteed that extremists would rise up and would lead to a much more difficult racial reconciliation.
Yeah, I know, it's funny. It's funny. I mean, we probably will get tagged as closeted neo-Confederates, but if anything, if you're interested about some version of equality, if you're not willing to make this argument, if anything, you're just furthering making things worse in that grounds. Would you agree?
Can you repeat that again? Sorry.
For entertaining the De Lorenzo, so Jaffa called De Lorenzo a neo-Confederate.
Oh yeah.
So
we'll be called that probably.
Yeah. So just by entertaining this argument, but see, it's funny if they don't entertain this argument. I mean, they have no idea about the past. Like they have this sort of weird Church of Lincoln view of the Civil War, which makes no sense when you look at what Northern public opinion is, look at Southern Democrats too. So yeah.
Yeah, but the other thing too is it's interesting as well. Immediately after the Civil War, Sherman, who's sort of like the arch uber enemy of the South, was actually sort of seen as a good old boy, and it was only really with the rise of the lost cause narrative during radical Reconstruction that people in the South really started to turn against Sherman, which is interesting. You'd think that the people right after the war would hate Sherman the most, but it's the people furthest removed from the Civil War that hate Sherman the most. Which it's interesting how history goes through that. It's like you never even lived under the making Georgia howl on the march to Savannah, but you seem to hate him more than the people that lived through it. In fact, when he visited Atlanta after the war, they welcomed him.
Yeah, they welcomed him.
Yeah. So, there didn't seem to be a whole lot of hard feelings, at least during that period.
Yeah, if anything, I think in some ways the settlement was as lenient as it could be, which is a case against the Southern nationalists, I think. Considering the cost of war, I don't know what could be stomached by the North, a settlement that was weaker. Would you agree?
I think I would agree. It was a generally lenient settlement given the barbarity of the war itself. I mean, none of the Confederate leadership, to my knowledge, was tried for treason. They were allowed to keep their arms.
Their horses.
as long as they promised not to raise up arms against the Union again. I mean, think about that. When in any other civil war, like in the 20th century or the 19th century, was the defeated side allowed to keep its own weapons?
Yeah.
Merely on the promise that they would not rise up against the Union again.
The French and Soviets kept German prisoners, I think, for like 6 years after, as workers or whatever you want to call them, to rebuild their own societies after World War II. So, I mean, all these cases, compared to other settlements, it's a fairly lenient settlement.
Or if you look at like Latin American civil wars, it usually involves the defeated side being massacred.
Yes.
And so in that sense, while we can criticize Lincoln for his tyranny and brutality, we also need to be cognizant of the fact that given the 19th century and the 20th century, this is one of the most lenient settlements in a civil war. I think something coterminous with the Civil War was the Taiping Rebellion in China. And you look at that, and when the Qing dynasty finally conquered the rebels, they just slaughtered everybody. They went into the villages and just killed them all, burnt them to the ground. It was a totally, Genghis Khan style. And you compare that in the North, and you burn down the Shenandoah, you burn down Georgia during the war, right? That's the key thing, not after the war as reprisals. So I think all sides, the Libertarians, the Neo-Confederates, and the Church of Lincoln, are on to something, but then they also tend to, due to their ideological blinders, ignore other elements affecting the Civil War.
Yeah. So I want to get into one final interesting point, which is somewhat made by the Econ Talk, and it's more of a general point about human freedom, which goes into the lead up to the Civil War. And this is you probably would like this the least, but I'll bring it up anyway. And it's one of the problems with looking back at the Civil War is how the conceptions of freedom change. And this is actually what the Church of Lincoln is dead on about being sort of Lincoln worshipers. Is that, and I think we got pointed to the last episode, why were we celebrating 4th of July when half of them were slave owners? It's somewhat I'm trying to put the but I'll go to what I've written about Thaddeus Russell. Thaddeus Russell's argument about slavery in his book Renegade History of the United States is that in a lot of ways slaves were more free. It's a very radical argument he made in the School Sucks podcast, which again you might not like as much. What would you make of that claim?
Well, what it does is it does show that he has a radically different view of freedom than most people. And even in the School Sucks podcast, he's saying not that the slaves were more free cerebus paribus,
yes,
but that in certain areas. But this is where his analysis becomes difficult and it's got problems. So, for example, he also points out in his book Renegade History of the United States that during the 1930s, when the federal government interviewed the last surviving slaves, they finally remembered slave days precisely because they could do the kinds of things that he says they were allowed to do, whereas the free person couldn't. And basically, he's trying to, I think, have his cake and eat it too, because the correlation since the 1960s is not that political and economic freedom advance in tandem with sexual freedom. In fact, Thaddeus was supposed to be the first to tell you we're sloping into tyranny, where the federal government has more controls over our economic life, more controls over our political life, while at the same time giving us more sexual freedom. So clearly these things they're negatively correlated. And he points that out in his book, but he doesn't seem to draw the right conclusions from that negative correlation.
As a tyrannical institution today, do you think I think slavery as bad is largely overrated. I don't want slavery re-implemented. I don't want to be a slave, but nonetheless, that's one reason why I'm a libertarian. I don't want to be a slave, but I think we opened up the episode, slavery is almost a meaningless word today. First of all, you have the contextualized slavery. Lots of similar institutions exist at the time, including in the free North amongst free workers. And so considering all this, considering all this about slavery, was the Civil War worth it? I'd say in the end, I'm not a supporter of the Confederacy, but I would say in the end, the Civil War prosecuted by the North was not worth it.
Yeah, I would tend to agree.
I'm not a supporter of slavery, but I'm just saying, in the end, considering its outcome, I don't know really what was gained by it. And actually, many of the new abolitionists and civil rights people, if Civil War was so successful, why did they need the civil rights movement? Your audience is a little different than me probably, but it's funny. The Church of Lincoln seems to be like, the Church of Lincoln, I think, in the end, will be a historical anachronism in the sense that of their Lincoln worship, which probably will die out, and he'll just be somewhat forgotten. Might somewhat forgotten.
Well, I would add one thing for the new abolitionists. This kind of gets back to the argument that you brought up with Hummel and the Revolution. The idea that the things that they want could have happened without Lincoln is silly as assuming that England would still have abolished slavery in 1833 if and the neo-mercantilists would not have doubled down if the revolution had failed or not happened. And those people looking back might say, well, Lincoln isn't really our guy in the sense that he has everything we believe, but without Lincoln, what Lincoln did, it's doubtful that they would even exist in the form they do now. But I'm looking at it in the sense that the cost of freeing the slaves, I don't know if any economist has calculated the value of each individual slave and how much the union would have had to pay for all of them. If that had been done, I think it'd still be cheaper than the war, just in the cost of the war, let alone the human cost, which is much more difficult to calculate. And second of all, the interventionist government has got into a lot of troubles around the world. And it would have been a lot harder for a divided North America to have engaged in all these imperialist adventures.
Oh yeah, that's Tom Woods' main point when people call him a neo-Confederate, is that Tom Woods will say, look, if there was no major U.S. government, there'd be no Spanish-American War, there'd be no American invention in World War I. I mean, that would probably have improved situations. There'd be no American invention. Now, America would still exist as a continental force, but it'd be much more limited power. I think much more scattered sovereignty. It'd be much, would you agree?
Yeah, and the other thing is that the libertarians point out is it might have led to other secessionist movements if the South had been. That was another thing I think the Church of Lincoln, in their goal is to preserve national sovereignty, are right to be afraid of. If they allow one group to leave, it might incentivize others to leave. Which is weird, as Jeffrey Hummel points out, is that oftentimes, and Keith Preston is probably very aware of this. This is something Keith Preston is probably very aware of it. It's weird. Oftentimes, the people who are nationalists, small. The people. What was the comment he made at the end about your episode about the law of Moses? I forget. I'm totally blanking on the point. Was it about slavery?
No. It was about the people like Ron Paul tend to be localists, but yet have an isolationist foreign policy, and people on the progressive left will call him bigots because he has somewhat anachronistic views to them, but he's an isolationist. He's against the war of Iraq. I mean, he's one of the biggest critics of the war of Iraq, by the way, and American foreign policy. But I think the Southern Poverty Law Presenter calls him a neo-Confederate. So people like that, the Ron Pauls of the world, are the isolationists. Would you agree?
Yeah.
So his history of Civil War is quite interesting. So in the end, who do you think? Do you think there's any Jacobin elements in the South? Do you think the expansion of slavery at the behest of North is itself a kind of weird, anachronistic Jacobinism? Like, what would you say? Is there any Jacobins that you would call in the South?
I don't really think the South can be accused of Jacobinism because it fundamentally didn't believe in human equality.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean they couldn't engage in tyrannical acts, but Jacobinism, as we discussed in our very first interview discussion, is substantively different.
Okay. Uh, do you have any more things to add about the
No,
other sources?
I think we're good. Unless you have anything else you want to add.
Um, outside of Lincoln, so overall, also a quick run through. Overall, do you think Lincoln is overrated or underrated by the mainstream? I would say unequivocally overrated. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends in what
Who's the
sense.
mainstream? But
Abraham Lincoln's political accomplishments, I don't think are overrated. It's his moral accomplishments that I think are, and the fact that they sort of deify him as this quasi-divine figure, which is just, it's ludicrous. But as a politician, he was extremely successful in getting what he wanted. And in that sense, he probably does deserve to be considered one of the great men of history.
The Grant and Sherman.
Oh, clearly overrated. Sherman, I think, was better, but like I said, I think Thomas should be at the top of the Union generalship list.
Davis, Jefferson Davis.
I don't really, I mean, in the mainstream, I guess Jefferson Davis is probably somewhat underappreciated.
And lastly, Robert E. Lee. I think he's overrated. I mean,
Yeah,
because if he was so brilliant, why didn't he? But yeah, I think he's overrated. Alrighty, well, this was interesting. So, all right.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, Tim. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast.